The Bob Murphy Show, episode 249. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bob Murphy Show. Today I'm going to be broadcasting for you an interview I recently did for the Battle Born podcast, which is the official podcast of the LP out of Nevada. It's hosted by Randy Sudduck and Adam Heyman. Randy is described at their website as a small business owner and podcast director for the LPNV. And Adam, amongst his other titles, is a Southern Regional Rep. And he's also on the executive committee of the LPNV. And what we talk about in this podcast episode is basically my pamphlet on Texas secession or independence, as I like to frame it. And it's, they asked me, well, how did I get into that? And just raise a lot of the issues and involve some of the objections and so forth. So if you haven't heard me talk about it before, this is a good place to jump in. And even if you have heard me talk about it before, the discussion now is a bit more current eventsy because it's current. And so you may still enjoy it. So without further ado, here is my discussion on the Battle Born podcast talking about the case for Texas secession.
And it's the Battleborn podcast. I'm your host, Randy Sudduck. With me is Adam Heyman. Hey, Adam.
Hey, Randy. How are you?
Good. And also joining us today is Bob Murphy. Hey, Bob.
Hey, guys. Just want to let everyone know I am at a commercial establishment because my home Wi-Fi went out. If you hear background noise, that's what it is.
So what you're saying is the NSA sabotaged your home internet connection and you had to flee to a coffee shop.
It's kind of silly on their part because they should have just laid low without me knowing, and then they could keep intercepting it.
It's government inefficiency that will let us win, Bob.
No, I know what it is. They have agents working at the Starbucks. That's what it is.
They just made your coffee for you. Your latte.
They did. Right. And all of a sudden, the case for freedom evaporates.
So Bob agreed to come on because we wanted to talk about secession and national divorce, and you had put out a pamphlet about Texas secession. And well, actually, you know what? Maybe let's back up. Can you just give us a brief blurb on you, Bob? I mean, I'm sure most people who listen to this know, but just a quick thing.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I'm an economist. I'm a member of the Austrian School of Economics. I got my degree from NYU. I taught at Hillsdale College for 3 years. I worked for Arthur Laffer in the financial sector for about a year. And then more recently, I was at Texas Tech. They have what's called a free market institute. They're headed up by Ben Powell. It's kind of very Austrian-centric program there. But yeah, mostly I write books and articles and things working through various think tanks to explain how the market economy works to the layperson. And I have written a lot on like the mechanics of a totally free society or an anarcho-capitalist world as depicted by Murray Rothbard in that tradition.
And you've done talks about how maybe the military could be privatized as far as providing defense, and all that stuff is on I think it's the Mises YouTube channel.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of my lectures were given at the Mises Institute's Mises University, which is their week-long program in the summers. So yeah, if you go to the Mises Institute's YouTube channel and look up Murphy private defense or something, you'll see all kinds of talks on that stuff.
That's great. Now, I had asked you to come on because we did want to talk about this pamphlet that you wrote about Texas specifically and secession and the mechanics of it. Can you just briefly give an overview of why you picked Texas as a case study? Yeah.
Sure thing. And before I forget, let me just mention, so it's at TexasCommonSense.com if people want to go get the free version of this. Yeah, so I think a lot of people have known for a while that tensions were brewing, and I sort of gave up the strategy of, if we could just elect the right people and send them to Washington, that'll fix things. Real quick detour story. There was a rep in California at the state level. He called me out once because I had written a pamphlet for a California-based free market think tank about how California could revise its tax code. And, he always wonders if they went to a flat tax. And this guy really got, he read it and loved it and called me in, and he really got it too. It's not just like 30,000 foot. He understood, the incentives and all that stuff. And he was gung ho. He was newly elected, and he wanted to introduce it in the next session and all this stuff. And was just asking me for, can we be in touch with you? And his chief of staff at the end of this little meeting said to him, this won't even get out of committee. The other Republicans will not support something this radical. This isn't going to go anywhere. And then your opponent in the next election is just going to use this against you. So he kind of talked them out of it. And the guy said, well, Dr. Murphy, thanks for flying out here, and we'll be in touch, and never heard from him again. And so, that really just drove home for me. Even people who want to do the right thing and they go into politics to go, reform the system or whatever, it's just set up that it doesn't work. So because of that, I had fallen out of, I wasn't pushing politics or anything for a while. And then I just came to believe that at this point, the only thing that's going to work to at least have some semblance of a resurgence of political liberty in our lifetimes, at least, would be if the states break up.
And for reading Common Sense, it sounds like one of your principal aims was to try and make that breakup happen in a peaceful way rather than us having to shoot at one another.
Oh, yeah, right, exactly. So yeah, that was my big thing, was to try to bring the argument like before it was actually happening, but it's still a hypothetical. And basically, one of the main aims I wanted was, if we can get this, I hate to say this word, but start a conversation on this stuff and just get people who in practice we think would be against it to just concede and say, just, hypothetically speaking, if, 70% of the voters in Texas said they want, on a statewide referendum, so they want to break away from the U.S. federal government, would you guys be okay with the U.S. government bombing them into submission? And just to get them on record to say, well, no, they shouldn't do that, and just because that's, what needs to happen in order for it not to. So that's, you're right, Adam, that one of the reasons for me writing that stuff, I think it's going to happen either planned or chaotically. Let's at least have an orderly withdrawal, have people, have committees and drop, what do we do about Social Security and Medicare and all this stuff, rather than it just happening because the dollar crashes and, and people just decide we're going to stop sending taxes to watch it.
It seems almost too obvious at this point, but you start Common Sense with a description of what the two Americas are and why this is necessary to be even thinking about. Do you maybe want to give a brief overview of what you're talking about? What are these two Americas you're talking about, Dr. Murphy?
Well, sure. So obviously, for anybody who's over 30, the United States has always had like a bifurcated political system, and, not so much Republicans and Democrats, but more like conservative liberal is the way it, and then people get more refined. And, oh, I'm a libertarian or whatever. But it seemed, especially since the Trump years, that it's just really turned into two different realities. I'm the first person to say this, but it's like one half of it's not so much half and half. It's more like a third and a third, I would say. And then there's another third that's kind of apathetic. But 1/3 of the country is literally watching one movie, and the other third is watching a different movie. And it's just amazing. Like, they can watch the same events, listen to the same talk, and come away and say different things. With Trump's infamous line about the very fine people, his defenders are watching that and saying, yeah, he was talking about the people who are okay with the, Civil War statutes. He explicitly said he was not talking about the neo-Nazis or whatever. And then the other people to this day keep saying, and Trump said neo-Nazis were very fine people. And it was like, he literally said like 3 times to clarify in that press conference, that's not what he meant. So, and there's all sorts of different, all this stuff with whatever one's views on these things, but, transgenderism and these are real basic things where one group is saying, no, this is just the natural extension of the civil rights movement. Just like people in the 50s didn't want white and black people dating. Some people today, think it's weird if, someone who's born transgender is showering with the girls in the locker room in high school, and other people are like, what are you even saying? That's a guy. What are you talking about? So, this isn't a matter of, I think the capital gains tax should be cut or raised. These are really fundamental things. And when you're talking about people's kids, they get, this is not something that's just up for debate at the next election. And And then the one thing I threw in there too, just to drive that point home, was that they literally were playing, I don't know if they're still doing this, but they were playing two different national anthems at football games. Like, just to show, like, what more do you need to see that there's literally at this point two different Americas in the same geographical region.
For sure.
And, you know, as we're recording this, Biden just had his primetime address with the red backdrop on it. And I mean, I was like, oh, well, some of the optics there, and people are acting it, or some people are saying like, oh, wow, they really dropped the ball on that. And as if they accidentally put the light, like that was just a trivial detail that they left to an intern. What lights are we going to come on? I mean, weddings, you know what the lighting's going to look like. That's well planned out. You don't think a presidential address on national television that they knew exactly what they were doing with the Marines. So at this point, it's clear they're pushing, like, it's the powers that be, the people, you know, they're pushing division.
For sure. I mean, maybe Biden doesn't know what words are put on the teleprompter for him because he's so brain-addled, but somebody wrote, hey, say that MAGA Republicans are a clear and present danger to our democracy. Those words have legal meaning, and it's not peace and sunshine and daisies. They're giving themselves the legal context to round us up and kill us.
Right. And all the stuff about, you know, treason and, you know, the insurrection and all that stuff. Again, I think it's partly to get their own base warmed up so that when they do start kicking in doors and arresting, you know, militia nuts and whatever they're going to be doing, the rest of the country is like, well, I mean, they literally are trying to overthrow the government. What do you expect them to do? You know what I mean? So I think it's not merely like, oh, we want to energize the base to win the next, you know, to do okay at the midterms. Like this, I think really is, you know, part of a more sinister long-term plan. But even if it weren't, I mean, the way things are going, it was clear to me that the states are going to break up in some fashion. And I thought, let's make the case. So as you said, Adam, just let them go. And that's one of the chapters in the book. I'm not just trying to rile up the people who would be for it, even the people who would be against it. I'm trying to convince them, let them go. You know,
you make a great case. It'll be better for them if they just let it happen. But before we get there, why did you pick Texas as the best example of a state that has all the things lined up for it to be workable as a state to secede?
Okay, sure. So, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying, you know, because I knew a bunch of people like in New Hampshire that when they saw this, they're like, oh, but what about New Hampshire? I'm not saying other states shouldn't try this, and people who are working for independence for their own individual states, you know, more power to you. I'm not saying give up your efforts. And I'm also not even predicting that Texas would be the first to break away. Like right now, you know, Florida obviously is looking more of the, you know, Charlie Brown of the class than Texas is. And the stuff in the Northwest, it's died down a little bit, but, you know, if the dollar were to crash, it wouldn't surprise me if the Pacific Northwest is the one that just de facto at least went off the map. But the reason I picked Texas, to me, that was just a clear-cut, strongest case. All the conventional arguments for why, it wouldn't work, fall away. That, like for a lot of the other states, you know, for an interior state, just logistically speaking, it would be difficult for them to break away if the rest of the U.S. government weren't on board with it, because they were just in the middle. They could totally seal them off. Even like Florida, if Florida actually got into active hostilities with the U.S. government, they could just take the Navy and blockade them. And that would be tough. Whereas with Texas, with the long border with Mexico, the U.S. government would have to interfere with the Mexicans. You know, in other words, they would have to pick a fight with another country if they wanted to seal off trade between Mexico and Texas. And also Texas, via Mexico, has access to two different oceans. So again, it would be a lot harder to seal them up. Texas is huge. You know, it would be one of the top economies in the world, even on its own, population-wise. So in terms of all these things, and then the other one was Texas for a while was its own republic, right? And to this day, like I lived in Texas for a while. I mentioned earlier that I had taught at Texas Tech for a bit. So kids, when you go to school at Texas, in your elementary school, you learn Texas state history. It's not just U.S. history, where it's like I was in upstate New York. We didn't learn about the state of New York's history, and we didn't care. But for Texans, like that's part of their heritage. So just in terms of them being independent, another quick example is I've heard that when people from Texas are like visiting Europe and someone over there says, "Oh, hey, where are you from?" They'll say Texas. They don't say America or the U.S. So for all those reasons, I just thought if we were going to make the case for why a particular state should be the first to go, Texas, like there's no reason it should. Texas has just been its own country for a long time. Nobody would bat an eye.
Do you think in the time frame as far as things coming to a head, as you had mentioned, the rhetoric has been ratcheted up. I mean, do you think something would happen maybe in the next 5 to 10 years or 15 years? Or, I mean, how would you see things?
I definitely think that like the dollar will crash within the next 10 years, let's say. And when that happens, I think so things might happen before that point, but I think that's the ultimate, because right now, the U.S. government has a really big military, but with all the stuff, the debacle in Afghanistan, the withdrawal and so forth, that's less the case. I think, China's beefing up its Navy a lot. So, and it's every year, I think the U.S.'s military dominance is falling. But then it also just has a lot of money. And so, or, it's cash flow, let's say. It's actually deeply in the red in terms of its assets and liabilities, but cash flow is huge. So that's partly how it can maintain this. But when, in other words, part of how Washington keeps people on board is by bribing them, or by threatening to turn off, the spigots. And so if it gets to the point, if the dollar were to crash and then Washington can't just keep printing money and sending it to its people that wants to keep on board, that's when, like we said, at the very least, there'll be a de facto breaking away, that you can see the various like places, states that weren't really on board with all the edicts from Washington, just quietly not enforcing them. And then, Washington just can't send federal agents all over the country. So I think you're going to see stuff like that. And I think that will happen within 10 years, if not sooner.
Maybe you could go through some of the nuts and bolts of what you think would happen if Texas were to secede, because a lot of people, this is such a shift in paradigm that they can't even, like what would happen with the people who have entitlements agreements with the federal government? What would happen with trade? What about immigration? What would you do with the army bases? All those things. Maybe you could run through a few examples.
Okay, sure. And again, this is all spelled out. People go to texascommonsense.com. But yeah, so like as far as Social Security, Medicare, stuff like that, I said just conceptually right now, if someone moves from the United States to France, renounces his U.S. citizenship and becomes a French citizen, it's not, they have mechanisms in place. And so they still can get their Social Security at that point, based on certain criteria and whatever, how old they are when they move and things like that, how long they've been in the system. They can't get Medicare because it's got to be spent in a U.S. hospital. And so, there's things like that, right? So I'm saying conceptually what would happen, I think like legally and administratively, the way you handle it is it's as if all of a sudden, it's supposed that people in Texas voted to become, their own republic again, Republic of Texas, that all the people that were in Texas at that point would now be living in a foreign country. And then you would just treat it the same way. Right. And so, there'd be a scale issue, but conceptually, if somebody right now moves from the U.S. to another country, it's not like, oh my gosh, you're not allowed to do that, because how would we know what to do with the national debt? Because now you're not part, so all that stuff, I just handle it the same way. The military bases there, I think the way to treat it is, that would make the most sense is to say those are federal assets. And so the Texas authority, so just as if they vote for Texas independence and Shell or Exxon owned refineries that happen to be located in Texas, it's not that the now Texas state officials would say, well, we're going to nationalize those and that's our oil now. Like as if they were Castro or something. No, these are clearly were owned by certain corporations or whatever. And just because now we voted to secede and dissolve political ties with Washington, that doesn't change the property rights to the stuff in our jurisdiction. And so if you get how that makes sense, that they couldn't just nationalize that. By the same token, right now everybody agrees that there's a U.S. Army base that's located in Texas, that's a federal asset. And so I think by the same token, the Texas authority, it's not that they all of a sudden would just get access to those munitions and whatever, that they would say this is, but now you've got a sovereign nation that's got some foreign nations, air bases and army camps and whatever on their soil. You're allowed to tell them you need to withdraw. Just like if there was a change in elections in, Afghanistan or Iraq or something, and they all of a sudden decided, you know what, these U.S. occupying forces, even though they were invited here by our predecessor with the new elections, whatever, we want you out. So, in practice, you could say, well, what happens behind the scenes and is there leverage where? But I'm just saying, legally speaking, I think that's the cleanest way to handle it. It's not that the Texas authorities all of a sudden become owners of the U.S. military bases and such, but they can then tell them, you guys got to withdraw. And then the last one I'll handle here is the immigration. So from the U.S. government's point of view, they would now just be a matter of redrawing the border. So instead of it being, the southern border of Texas with Mexico is the line, now the line would be a little bit more jagged. You would just go around the border, and that would be now the new U.S. southern border, which again is another reason why Texas breaking away is conceptually not that big a deal, as opposed to some interior state that would be weird. And then, as far as the Texas official, so I would think it'd be in both countries' interest to have a relatively quick checkpoint, into and out of Texas. And I mean, if people before COVID, at least going in and out of Canada wasn't a big deal. And so, it could be the same sort of thing here. And, but keep in mind also too, that if Texas is smart and doesn't put in an income tax, then it's going to be an economic powerhouse. So any immigrants coming from Mexico into Texas are probably going to stay there. Right. So sure. It's not just going to be like some sieve and that's why, oh no, we're getting overrun because these Texans aren't. And even right now too, the issue with the southern border and, illegal immigration, it's not because the Texans are unwilling to enforce the border. It's the federal level. So I think, the Texans kind of being law and order, rah, rah, probably would actually enforce their border more than, probably even against my own advice, in terms of they care what I thought about it. But I'm just saying in practice, if regular Americans are worried, well, no, if Texas left, then we'd have this gaping hole and all these hordes of people would come through the southern border no, that's a silly concern.
I think sometimes people on the left or right will say, well, okay, secession seems a little radical. Why don't we just redouble our efforts and take control of the national apparatus and then insert our policies and everything will be fine? But I think we've already talked about the seething hatred and resentment of the other half of the country will always make that an unstable solution. But what about another one? Maybe the newfound respect for federalism that's occurred in the last handful of years, especially since COVID, but even before that with left-leaning states just ignoring the federal drug laws, for example, and just saying, hey, marijuana is legal here, I don't care. So it seems on the left and right, federalism and decentralization of political power is starting to become a thing that people are thinking about again. Do you think if that trend continues, maybe we can avoid the necessity of having to do some sort of a secession-based movement?
I mean, certainly people pushing that stuff, again, I think they should keep doing that. It's multi-pronged strategies. People working on cryptocurrency and whatever, that's great. Patrick Friedman, I don't know if he's still working on his floating cities that are, all that stuff is great. And they all reinforce each other too, and I point that out, in the pamphlet to say that even the people who are working to reform the system, in their own legislatures and whatnot, if there's an escape valve, if Texas were to break away, then people still in Illinois who are working on, keeping taxes reasonable or whatever, they could just say, well, look at how many of our residents are fleeing to Texas, this new Republic of Texas, because the tax burden is so much lighter there, we can't tax too much. So all this stuff kind of reinforces each other. But I guess the secession is just the logical fruition of it. And again, I don't think you're going to get Adam a situation where, maybe they won't enforce local drug laws and things, but people are still going to have to pay their federal income tax. And that's a huge one. And so, to me, I think that's just a big example. And also to be less dependent on, the US dollar and be subject to the whims of the Federal Reserve. That's, again, something that's going to be tricky to do. I mean, I guess you could still you do have initiatives right now of the states trying to allow their citizens to diversify away from the dollar. But yes, those are helpful trends. And I just think, though, that this is one. And again, I think it's not a matter of, I don't need to sound like Karl Marx, like this is coming and it's inevitable, so you might as well just accept it. But I do think that this states there is going to be a de facto. So maybe the trend you're talking about in practice, it'll be just like in like Colombia or whatever. There's certain regions that everyone knows, the cartels kind of control that. And they, it's not as if they necessarily had a referendum and went through a thing that passed constitutional muster to break away. It's just kind of, everybody knows, if you go in there, the cartels are in charge. So it could be some hybrid of those sorts of things where in certain regions, everybody just knows, nobody there files IRS returns and the feds are okay with that because it would be too costly to send Marines in there.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. Because the IRS will literally go around the world trying to track you down if you wanted to move to Malaysia or something like that. You can't escape them. I think that's our country is the only one that does that. If you move to a different country, so that's interesting.
If I could just great point, Randy. Let me just elaborate just to make sure some of the listeners. I was shocked when I first learned this, and so my wife and I, we really have been. We're moving to Florida as of right now, but we are also looking abroad at things just to have exit options. And yes, that it's the U.S. I think, and one other country that like you've never even heard of before are the only countries that say wherever our citizen, if you have a U.S. passport, if you're a U.S. citizen, we don't care where you are on Earth. We look at how much that local government taxes you, and then if you don't pay as much to them as you would pay to us if you were in the U.S., then you owe us the difference, roughly speaking. And that's like you said, Randy, that's like the U.S. and one other country on Earth does that. And it makes it really tricky. And also, too, I've heard horror stories, people who, wealthy people that have said, I'm out of here. And they live abroad and they just, with all the FATCA and all these other things that they've been clamping down in the last decade on people living abroad and making sure they pay their fair share. And so people will go to their embassy and turn in the paperwork to renounce their U.S. citizenship. And just years will go by, they just won't process it. It's like, what are you supposed to do? So it's like the thing when they say, well, if you don't like it, leave. And I'm like, okay. And they're like, well, you can't leave. So
a lot of people will say, if you bring up the subject of a state seceding, that's just nuts. I mean, didn't the Civil War settle this? And you handled that objection very nicely and common sense. I was wondering if you remembered it enough to run through it again.
Right. So, and you're right, Adam. That comes up within 3 minutes of typically talking about this online. So the Civil War settled this question, didn't it? So just on its own terms, if you just think through what they're saying, it's disgusting, right? That they're saying, oh, you don't have the right to do something because before someone else tried to exercise that right. And the more powerful force just slaughtered them and then beat them into submission. So clearly you must not have that right after all. So this is a line, I got this from Tom Woods, actually. He said that would be as disgusting or that have the same validity. Imagine if somebody was working, agitating for an activist for Native Americans, saying, I think these Aboriginal people, they should have more autonomy. If you go look at these reservations, they're in disarray and the federal government needs to back off and give them more autonomy. And imagine if someone said, well, didn't the Trail of Tears settle this question? Right? If somebody said that, like they would lose their job. And yet when it comes to the Civil War, like that's, or secession, the ability of people. So there's that element. And just in general, I mean, I had another part of the pamphlet where I was saying, just to think through when people are saying, well, won't this lead to a Civil War? Like last time, I mean, if you don't want that to happen, here's what needs to happen. This is the scenario in which it doesn't lead to a Civil War is if some people in Texas, let's say they vote to break away and the U.S. government chooses not to drop bombs on them. So there you go. Because the people of Texas are not going to say, we're leaving. Oh, and by the way, we're going to send missiles into Washington too on our way out the door. They're not going to do that. The only reason hostility would happen is if the federal government said, if you have the audacity to try to leave, we're going to kill you. And then the Texans in self-defense would say, well, we're not going to just sit here and let you shoot us. So that's all that needs to happen. And again, we can't prove it wouldn't, but I think it would be difficult, if people are going to have their iPhones and whatever and be taking pictures, be kids in Dallas with their limbs blown off. Because why? Because their parents thought Thomas Jefferson was serious when he said, we have the right to do this. Right. Sure. So it's just the cognitive dissonance. And also too, and this is getting into, like you were saying, Adam, when I was explaining to skeptics what, like, if this were to happen, let's say you need to support it, like you should let them go, right? How could the U.S. government ever lecture some other foreign leader on, not cracking down on dissidents in their jurisdiction if the U.S. is bombing people in Texas or Florida or wherever it is, because they had the audacity to think they had the right to self-determination.
Another beautiful crystallizing metaphor that you used is if you find yourself in an abusive relationship and the only reason that you're not leaving is you think you're going to get your ass kicked if you do, well, that's exactly the time you ought to think about packing your bags and finding a way to get out of that abusive relationship.
Right.
So if they're really, saying might makes right, then maybe this isn't the political association that you really want to be involved in.
Yeah, and on that point too, it really is shocking to me how many people, and in both the right and the left too, just sort of breezily say, well, no, secession's not an issue because there'd be another civil war. Like they would, Washington wouldn't allow that. So let's talk now about getting the right people on the Supreme Court. And they said, whoa, hang on, you're just admitting the reason you don't want to support secession is because they would just murder us. Doesn't that mean we're part of this system? And so right. And also too, like, to continue that metaphor, it's, suppose there were, a woman that was in a relationship with like a mob boss or whatever, just real abusive guy that could seriously, have her killed or whatever if she were to leave. It's not necessarily the right thing to say, oh, you just need to leave tomorrow, pack your bags and go, because she, what if she's like saying, no, really, he will find me. Like, you can say, I can move to another city. He has people, he would find me. So maybe the right thing is to, lay low for a while and just go along with the motions. But like you said, Adam, you need to start thinking, like, how could I get out of this? It's not just, well, I guess I'm going to have to stay with him forever because, he'd kill me otherwise. Okay, what am I going to do? I'm getting my nails done tomorrow. Like, that's not the thing. So yes, maybe in a real situation, you do. So if somebody said, I don't think secession is the right thing right now because they would bomb us, but I agree with you, we shouldn't. This is a horrible system. Let's think long-term. How can we extricate ourselves? Okay. But just to breezily say, wow, they would kill us. So let's go back to, trying to do better in the primaries next time.
Do you have the strongest arguments? What would be your maybe the strongest points in staying and staying in the union as far as like for Texas? Do you have any? If you were playing devil's advocate on yourself?
Sure. I mean, it probably would just be similar to what we just said, that things get messy fast and you can't. So I would think, like, if I were, a Gandhi or somebody and, and if I could just get all the people in Texas to follow the strategy and say, no, we cannot, be provocative or whatever. You do not go and drive by a military base and start shooting at Marines. You don't online say, really over the top stuff about what you're going to do. Then, I think there'd be a much better chance of them breaking away with, like I said, if they handled it very peacefully and legally going through all the motions. That's another reason too. I forgot to mention, you guys asked about Texas, is it's crystal clear. I documented in the pamphlet when Texas joined the union at the time, but there was all sorts of, if they want to return it, it's in their constitution and everything, the Texas state constitution. They can, if the will of the people doesn't support it anymore, they can leave. Right. So it's in terms of, if someone says, well, is this technically legal? It's clear cut that it is. They weren't giving some open ended. Okay, we're going to join the union, and now even if our descendants want to back out, tough. That's the language is there. So I'm saying if they were to go ahead and go through all those legal channels and do everything peacefully, I think it would be tricky for the U.S. government to just start dropping bombs. What instead would happen is if there was back and forth on both sides, and both sides could plausibly say to their biased base, they started it. What you know what I mean? Look what they just did. So in practice, if it got messy and a bunch of people did end up dead, you know, I could see saying, all right, that wasn't worth it. You know, this is too much bloodshed.
There is a sense in which it's always the seceding entity that gets tricked or forced into firing the first shot, because the United States would just come around and just ask for your taxes the Union ship was only trying to resupply Fort Sumter, and then they got fired upon by these unreasonable Confederates. You know, the people seceding will firing the first shot just to keep the federal government from coming in and doing the normal business, you know?
Right. Yeah. So that's the issue. Yeah. They would be sending federal agents in to go collect taxes and whatnot. And yeah, at some point, some people say, no, get out of here. And they would take it. Or, you know, they could even do false flags and whatever, but make it appear that way. So it is a difficult thing. But again, to answer Randy's question, that yes, in terms of, but that's precisely why I'm saying what I'm saying is I'm trying to right now make the case for peaceful secession and mostly just get everybody to agree, hey, if this were to happen, would you let him go? And then, you know, to try to just open up that discussion. But in practice, it's like I said, like we're looking at leaving the country too. So I'm not saying like, oh, let's all, you know, go to this thing and then we're gonna have our last stand and whatever, even though some people are thinking like that. So
do you have any thoughts on advice you want to give the future leaders of Texas or whatever secessionist movement to keep their republic from becoming oppressive and descending into chaos like the United States is? Just policies they should think about instituting, or principles, or?
Yeah. So, and I outlined some of those in the pamphlet. So one thing for sure is don't feel the need to just replace everything that the federal government does. And going along with it is you don't need to replace the IRS. So, right, for people who don't know, right now, Texas does not have a state level income tax. That's one of the reasons some people like going there, and their job growth has been relatively high over the past decade, let's say. So I was just saying, keep it that way. Don't feel like, oh, well, because now we're losing all these services from Washington, we got to replicate them. Well, how are we going to pay for it? We need to have our own income tax. No, don't do that. You want to be a magnet for people coming in. One thing I argued, and this might have surprised, because I've gotten a lot of good feedback from like pro-Texas groups, and you know, the Texit is the. I should also mention too, just so purists don't think I know, the hardcore guys, they use the term Texian to be like a citizen of the Republic of Texas, whereas a Texan is like, oh, if you think that Texas was a state in the Union or whatever. But you know, so anyway, just they make that distinction. But I think probably one element where a lot of them weren't on board with me is I said you guys should decriminalize drugs. And the reason I gave was not because of libertarian arguments about bodily autonomy and things like, even though I agree with all that stuff, but just a practical one that's saying, if you break away, you want Mexico to be a stable, strong ally to help, you know, resist if the U.S. starts ramping up stuff. You want Mexico to have their house in order. And the single biggest thing you can do to crush the cartels and sort of get rid of some of the corruption of Mexico's political system is to destroy the drug market, right? And if drugs were a normal business like anything else, then the Mexican cartels would lose a lot of their power and they wouldn't, you know, be such a destabilizing influence. So that's a bit of advice I gave. And then with the immigration stuff, yeah, I was saying, ideally, you would want to maintain good relations with the U.S. You don't want it to be like a huge hassle at Checkpoint Charlie every time someone's coming in and out of, you know, now the foreign United States. It's your country of Texas. So I was just saying, try to keep that free and open. And I also was saying, I don't think I got too specific because it's tricky, like even theoretically, to figure out, how do you handle this stuff if you believe in just unfettered private property rights? Like, so logically, I would just want each property owner to decide what to do. But just saying, resist the urge to crack down too much on letting people from the South move in because you want to grow your numbers. Like, that's the way you're going to be a bigger bite for Washington to try to, swallow, is if, you bump up your numbers. So you actually do want to have more people moving in.
Do you think that I was just thinking about what you were talking about as far as you don't want the federal the services that the federal government provides in Texas. You don't want like the income tax or different things like that. Do you think when people immigrate to Texas, that it's the whole California thing? People here in Nevada, they're coming from California. They bring their policies with them. They want, like a liberal a culture in Nevada. Is what is the argument? Do you think that is that would be something that could happen in Texas as well for people immigrating to that state? Don't you think? As far as like people who come into the state.
Yeah, and I've heard, so one of the better arguments I've seen from people who are skeptical that this would work out as cleanly as I'm hoping is they say, Bob, Texas is not homogeneous, and perhaps you being out in Lubbock, way in West Texas, which is where Texas Tech was, which is a pretty conservative area. Maybe you're not getting this, but Texas, there's pockets, of very liberal areas, and they were saying, so, what might happen is even if the whole state does vote, and that was the thing too that I said in there, that like it would have to be clear cut, like 2-1 in a referendum or something, like, so that it's just unambiguously, nobody could argue that this is against the will of the people if that phrase is to mean anything in terms of leaving. They say even if that were to be the case, there would be pockets, whether Austin or Dallas or whatever, where it would be more blue. And especially you could see with, like you're saying, Randy, with immigration, like as the Texas economy does better, more people are moving there just for economic reasons. And then wouldn't that give a pretext to the federal government to say, oh no, we're fine with, people's self-determination, but look at, in this recent referendum in Austin, it was actually 48-52. And so we need to go in and protect the rights of, the sizable minority there that are going to be oppressed, because of abortion restrictions or whatever, and that sort of thing. So, or, they're changing the curriculum in the school, now LGBTQ people are going to be, have the clock turned back. And so that's why we're sending in federal officials and whatever. It's just to maintain, these people are still U.S. citizens. They didn't renounce their citizenship. They can't. So yes, to answer your question, there is that element. And again, so suppose this really were to happen and Texas broke away and there was no federal income tax. I mean, people would be saving tens of thousands of dollars a year and their taxes just by moving to Texas. So there's a lot, anybody who works online or whatever would have a huge incentive to do that. And so you're right that and where would they be fleeing from is the blue states where they have terrible policies that are wrecking their economies. So yes, that is an issue that, when they come there and vote for. So that's a problem with all these so-called political solutions is, you're not solving the problem if it's people voting for stuff that is bad, right? That in other words, I'm not able to guarantee that, the people in Texas are going to vote smart because we'll write a new constitution and this time we mean it, that sort of stuff. So it's more though. And when people would say this, they'd say, Bob, I think actually what would happen, it's not just that Texas would break away, but there'd be regions of Texas that would fracture too. And that may be true and good. Like, because again, ultimately, my ideal system would be more like individual. It's like everybody's house would be its own country. Like that'd be one way to think about it.
I don't imagine you're scheduled to give PowerPoint presentation on this to the Texas State Legislature anytime soon. But do you know if anybody's been spreading this pamphlet around and getting people in there to look at it?
So for sure, what's interesting is there's I don't know if I'm probably not going to be able to come up with their name. There's this like government in exile of Texas, where there's people who don't think that the original joining the union was legal and whatnot, and they have some decent arguments as to why they think this. And so they were saying, no, technically the Republic of Texas has always been independent, and so they claim that they're the rightful current leaders of that republic or whatever. So they love this thing, and they were the ones that just said, we wish you hadn't called us Texans, we're Texians, that sort of thing. So they apparently at their meeting, someone got up and introduced it and just read the whole thing cover to cover, and everyone was like, oh, okay, we're here. And they voted to put that in their foreign policy or foreign education, because from their perspective, the United States is a foreign country, right? So it's really like, it's hard to like, oh, wow, these people are serious, but, and then yes, the other more mainstream groups that are working on what they call Texas secession. So I'm saying that group, they don't call it secession, because in their mind, we never joined.
Right.
It's just you're acknowledging, they're just affirming. It's affirmation.
As they gave you the lecture on the proper term, did they give you the etymology? What's with the extra I?
I don't remember, to be honest. It's it might just have been to make a distinction. I'm not sure. I think that's historically what the people in the Republic of Texas call themselves. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe it just got shortened. Maybe originally it was Texian, and then just over time, Texan is easier to say. I don't know. But yes, so other groups that are like just working for what they call Texit have gotten this and been talking to me. I did even know someone who, there is some committee like to work on this stuff at the state level, and he was talking to me about possibly having me as an advisor and whatever. But so far that hasn't come to fruition. So yes, to answer your question, Adam, the groups that have for a while been working on this stuff, I think they're all aware of this, and they like a lot of the arguments on it.
You mentioned it in the pamphlet that if Trump had won instead of Biden, you might have written the thing from the perspective of California, because a lot of the demographic and geologic conditions of Texas are the same for California, and they're large enough that they could do it. Or if DeSantis or Trump or whoever wins the presidency in 24, are you going to maybe repurpose it, republish it with California on the cover?
But I mean, and perhaps, yeah, it's in on that. It was the Trump and Hillary Clinton one, that there were polls of people in California that, yes, it was, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but yeah, a surprisingly large percentage of the people in California were saying they were open to the idea of California breaking away, with Trump possibly winning, and then vice versa with Texas and Hillary Clinton. So yeah, and I think, I mean, I'll just be honest. I never thought Roe v. Wade was going to get overturned. I thought the abortion activists were just engaged in fear mongering and stuff. And it's probably like how the left thinks, oh, no one's going after your guns, don't worry. Whereas like, the Second Amendment people are like, no, they really are. And they think, oh, come on, you stop being extremist paranoid. So yeah, when left-wing activists would say for a while, look at all these right-wing judges that the Republicans are appointing, they're coming after Roe. I thought that wasn't the case, but now we see that it is. And so, yeah, I think more people are realizing that as stuff gets more polarized, maybe it's a bad strategy to just say, well, we got to make sure no bad person ever gets installed again. I mean, that's, I guess, the one benefit of the demonization of Trump, which to me, I think was over the top, is that if left-wing progressives really think basically Hitler was elected by people who knew full well what they were doing, it was like, well, do you want to be in the same country with these people? Like that might happen again. Right. So it's wouldn't it be safer to not be at the mercy of people who, according to you, are willing to elect Hitler because their taxes are too high?
It's a little bit of a tangent and not quite your area of expertise, but do you think that the Supreme Court is starting to move in the area of decentralizing the decisions that they've made in the past. I mean, I never thought they'd overturn something was as old as Roe. What is it, over 50 years? But it sounds like if you listen to Clarence Thomas, he's starting to rethink the incorporation doctrine, for crying out loud. I mean, do you have any insight on what you think they're doing over there?
I mean, I don't have the particulars like to say, oh, I think they're going to go after this case next and then this and so on, and these long-standing precedents. But yeah, I guess I would say if they're willing to overturn Roe v. Wade, like that to me is the single biggest thing they could have, like, to show they're not afraid. Just like when Donald Trump came in and he pulled the United States out of the Paris Agreement, like the climate change thing, I was very surprised. Like, I knew he had been talking about, oh, we're not going to go along with these UN schemes and things like that. This is all a China hoax and blah, blah, blah. But I was really surprised he did that. And so likewise, it's Supreme Court willing to do this. Yeah, I think everything's on the table now, because that is the biggest thing they could have done in terms of just what's considered politically acceptable. And here's the range within which you're allowed to operate and be reasonable, and overturn their Roe. That's just like, what more would they be afraid of at this point? Like,
Right.
so, and, I do think like people on both sides agree that Roe v. Wade was terrible law. Like, it just, they was making stuff up and whatever, even if you're
Oh, yeah.
for abortion access, that the legal machinations through which they came up with that were kind of crazy. So it's, but if they were willing to do that, then yeah, you would think they would be willing to do all kinds of stuff.
Have you been watching New Hampshire and what they're up to with trying to get secession on the referendum or whatever it is they're doing? Do you have any thoughts on New Hampshire?
I don't know. If you want to tell me more about what it is, I can comment on it. But I mean, I know, like I said, when this pamphlet came out, some people in New Hampshire were asking me, can we take this and, adapt the arguments? And I said, sure. But I don't know the specifics of what they're working on right now.
No, I'm sorry. I don't either. I just started they were trying to get it on the referendum or something like that. The reason we had you on is because secession sounds cool, but we're just poor little Nevada here, and the federal government owns like 90% of us. So I guess we're screwed, right?
I mean, I think it would be trickier in a situation like that, even though, as a Rothbardian or something, we could argue, well, the means by which, they had stolen tax dollars and that's how they acquired or whatever the history is. But yeah, it would be trickier, I would think, to argue that, people who are surrounded by federal land
we just need an easement corridor that'll get us to the ocean.
Right.
Easements, right? Write it into the deed.
But I mean, even there, like, so people who would not move to Texas or whatever, like, they would still benefit, I think, from this, again, just to show the precedent. Because what really would have to happen for it to be, a successful experiment, let's say, is if Texas leaves, it's relatively peaceful, and then people can check in 5 years later and look at it, and it's up and running. It's, it didn't collapse into anarchy and all these, problems people said didn't happen.
Do you want to make a quick, direct pitch to the leftist, progressive, liberal types about how much better their life would be if they just let all the conservatives, in Texas secede and have the country's political demographics shift the way they obviously would?
Yeah, sure. So just some of the points I made that, again, and I wasn't saying this like tongue in cheek or whatever, but like, truthfully, I was trying to say the way things are going, there really is, I don't know if civil war is the right term, because that makes it sound like it's more like large scale military action. And it the weaponry of the federal government, it might not look like that right now, but I mean, it's moving where there's going to be brawls in the streets, like between Antifa and, patriot groups, let's call them. And so that's not good for anybody. And so we need to off ramp from this trajectory right now. And just having, if Texas, and I'm not even saying they need to support it, but just saying if a bunch of people in Texas voted to leave, clear cut majority, let's say 2/3 in a referendum, I'm saying you would have to let them go, right? And some of the arguments we've touched on a little bit is just in terms of, you say you believe in self-determination and democracy. Well, in any other country on earth, if a group said we want to leave, you would be okay with that. You wouldn't want the central government to use tanks to stop them. And then a couple of the other are just in terms of local politics that look at the things you want to get done in your own state in terms of, progressive policies. What's the sand in the gears? It's this, intransigent, really angry Fox News watching cohort that are not a majority in your state. Well, if a lot of those people would be the ones that would move to a free Texas, right? So that's just going to make things easier in your neighborhood. Like for you to get done what you want. So just let there be two systems, and let the people in Texas, they're going to be free. You're not going to change their mind. So instead of just using force to try to ram it down, so just let them go. And then you can at least have your area, and the people who agree with what you're doing can move to you and let them do it. And then the other thing, which it may not be as relevant because coronavirus isn't as hot a topic now as it was, when this pamphlet came out, but just to say, even on your own terms, as there's more, outbreaks or different things, and the people who really think, hey, everyone needs to mask, everyone needs to get vaccinated, get their booster shots, and I cannot believe there's selfish individuals not doing this. In terms of the epidemiology, I think it would definitely slow the spread, right? If most of the people who aren't going to do that, or who are going to fake their card and say, I got vaccinated, if they all went to one area and the people in your area were largely vaccinated, that stops mutations and things, even on your own terms, right? So in terms of a lot of the hot button issues that you care about right now, control over what gets taught in the schools, right? All these people are raising a fuss at the local parent-teacher meetings and whatever school board meetings. Let them move to Texas or wherever, Florida, wherever it breaks away. And then wouldn't that just make things a lot simpler? And yeah, you wouldn't get everything you wanted. There would still be people 1,000 miles away doing things you don't like, but wouldn't that be better than them stopping you from doing what you want in your own neighborhood?
Yeah, it's a great argument.
I'm just thinking that 10 years ago, or maybe a little over 10 years ago, it was you and Tom Woods talking about nullification. And we've progressed to this point where I think, didn't he come out with, or he bought the domain name for national divorce? I mean, so things have accelerated so far in relatively little time as far as where we're at.
I think so. And I think part of it is, let me just mention so I personally don't like the term national divorce. And partly it's because, like, I'm quote, against divorce, as a general principle, but also I think that gives too much credit to political associations, because it's not that anybody, when they join a larger group, said till death do us part, the way you say it, when you get married. And so it's, to me, it makes it sound like, oh, you were joined more closely, like, hey, you all agreed you were going to be part of this Washington system, and, in front of God and your families. And what are you doing now? You're just saying, oh, because it's inconvenient. I know I was going to be taxed so much. Come on. Like, it's not like that at all. Nobody agreed to this. And so, I guess, it would be like if you were divorcing from an arranged marriage but it was like something your great-great-grandparents arranged. So there's that element. But yeah, I think, again, I'm all for nullification and everything still too, but I think things have just gotten to the point where this, all the stuff they're bringing in with I think they're emulating the Chinese system with the social credit ratings and the coordination of the government with like large corporations. Like, it's just playing out in a way where the way they can control a lot of people is they technically just need to lean on the large corporations and just say, you want to stay on our good side. We got antitrust, we got, tax thing, we can audit you. There's all sorts of stuff we can do to you. SEC, all these things that if they want to just make life miserable for a large corporation, they can find a way so that they implement policies, and, they have all these social credit ratings and whatnot. And so they can really micromanage society in a way that, strictly speaking, it's not that they're violating constitutional rights, because they're not directly saying, oh, you as an individual, you're allowed to criticize the government. It's just, if you do, your social credit rating gets dinged. And then the hotels voluntarily have a policy where we give preference to people with a high credit rating or whatever. So you might not in practice be able to stay in a hotel or rent a car, but those are private companies. And that's actually, that's how they do it in China. Like, it's, when I was at Texas Tech, someone came and gave a presentation on that. And that was the model. It was that, like, the hotels would say, if your credit score is too low, we won't rent a room. And you said, what do they care if you criticize the government as well? Because then the hotel's credit rating gets dinged if they rent to too many people with a low credit rating score. You know what I mean? So it's this hierarchical system. Coercion is introduced, but it's at a few small choke points. And then the rest is like voluntary within that system.
Yeah, I love the argument that the social media companies that are throttling free speech, well, they're just private companies. It's like, well, yeah, but the heads of those private companies do get called in to testify before Congress, and the threat of them being nationalized, or their FCC situation being taken away from them. It's not like there's an obvious government interference in what they're doing, and that's before Zuckerberg told Rogan that, oh yeah, by the way, the FBI came in and told us go ahead and censor anything that you hear in the next week or two. Wink, wink. Came from the Russians.
Right. And even there, like that, it's tricky. So, the sort of like naive libertarians say, oh, it's a private company, they do what they want. I get why they're saying that, because it's a slippery slope. Like once you say, oh, well, then we want to, regulate. And so you can't, in other words, if the problem is that the government is doing all that stuff behind the scenes, it's not a solution to say, well, let's make sure the government does the right thing now. You know what I mean? So it's to say that the way we're going to deal with media censorship is to make them a public utility or whatever, a commons, and have, so that's now unconstitutional if you kick someone off Twitter. Like that, to me, that's a dead end as well. But yes, to merely just say, hell, private company, end this discussion, I think is overlooking the way in practice that they're going to, all this stuff like the World Economic Forum, those people aren't Marxists. Like they're social. A lot of them are socialists, but they're not Marxists. Like they believe in because a lot of them are shareholders in giant corporations or whatever. So they're technocrats, and the vision they see is just to sort of all the stakeholders at the table and whatever. So that it's like merging state and big business, big government, big business is merging, and that's kind of the model. And some of the libertarian arguments, I think, are just missing that context.
Yeah, it's the worst. That old argument, what's worse, corporate power or state power? Well, why can't we have both?
Right.
Working together to screw the individual.
And I think too, a part of the problem is a lot of American libertarians, growing up in our system where the federal government is always this big entity with the club, and then the corporations are the ones that are subservient. And that's kind of, Ayn Rand famously said that, big business was the most persecuted minority or something like that. But in other contexts, like again, when Klaus Schwab and these guys, when they have these world government forums and things, and they have agenda items, and they go to the heads of like smaller countries around the world and just say, hey, if you want to get on board with us, look at, we show you this. So you got to, here's what you need to do. You got to reform your tax system like this. You got to do blah, 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 blah. But, then we have these companies come in and they'll extract your mineral resources and this and that, but we'll give you this funding. And so it is more the ominous like thing the leftists would worry about, where some giant international corporation that's in league with the World Economic Forum, and they have ties to MI6 and all this stuff, and they come into some African country that has a lot of mineral resources and strike a deal with the local guy. Like it really is not just like, oh, laissez-faire market forces and yay, international trade. Like it's more ominous, and a lot of the typical arguments don't hold up when it's a $1 trillion corporation coming in to a relatively small government.
Everybody wants to seize the ring of power and use it to enact their vision of the good society. It's so hard to convince people that no, the solution is to throw the ring into the fiery pits of Mordor.
Right. And it's, and I understand there's this whole movement now. People call themselves post-libertarians. I'm sure you guys have seen. And I understand their frustration that they're saying, for a lot of the people who are fans of Ron DeSantis and the stuff he's doing in Florida, and say, look at our enemies are using the state against us. We have to use the state to fend them off. And then maybe down the road, we'll talk about getting rid of it. But yeah, right now, if we just sit here and stick to our principles, we're sitting ducks. So I understand their frustration, but at the same time, again, it's like, well no, if you're like, once you start acting like your enemy, then you turn into the monster.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that already. When DeSantis is protecting his citizens from the federal government, he looks like a hero. But I think he's already demonstrated that if he were in the presidency, he has authoritarian tendencies and they would come out. I mean, the things he wants to do to Disney, and he thinks he's fighting back against, the overreach from the left. But yeah, you don't give ideologues power to impose their will on other people. It's a mistake.
Yeah, and like just a specific example, like with the and there was the Texas analog of this too, like to say, no business operating within our state can have a test about whether their employees should be vaccinated or not.
Yeah,
and I understand like people saying, oh, because they're just trying to counteract all the pressure coming from Washington to say that you do need to do that, but even beyond that particular issue, but there's the slippery slope of, well, what if there really were a private organization that wanted to have certain standards and whatever, and then, for the state legislature or whatever, an executive order that come in and say, you can't do that. Again, I think it's naive to think it's going to stop there. And also on those particular ones, they could have more carefully worded it to just say, if you, violate federal law or executive order, whatever the heck it was, then, we will do everything in our power to protect you from federal penalties. You know what I mean? Like, we will not cooperate with federal officials. We will blah, blah, blah. And in practice, that would have been the same thing, but they made it into a catch-22 no matter what a business did. It was either break federal law or state law. And to me, that was just kind of a crazy situation. And everybody, the other thing too is, I think it just made the libertarians look bad because a lot of the same people who a few years earlier with the whole bake the cake stuff were saying, hey, if a private business doesn't want to serve gay couples or, in principle doesn't want to serve Jewish people or black people, so be it. That they can go out of business if the community is outraged, but the government has no business. But then it's like, whoa, a business wants me to put a mask on? Call the governor. This is crazy. This is unacceptable. Make that illegal. And so yes, I understand how. Well, no, see, this is different because, but it sure looks like when businesses are not serving people that aren't you, hey, that's laissez-faire, free market capitalism. But then if it's inconveniencing me, then all of a sudden this is outrageous and I want the, state government involved.
Yeah, it's ridiculous and short-sighted. I mean, we believe in private property and freedom of association. And really, as libertarians, all we have is our principles. If we start violating those, for whatever reason, well, we're not libertarians anymore. We're just some other kind of authoritarian that maybe is slightly less awful than, or is perceived as less bad than the left or the right.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, too, you can see how fast it unraveled. Like it was online, like the rhetoric going to, I think it was a United flight where it went viral where they were on the plane and I think the kid was 2 years old or something and they're trying to put the man and the kid didn't want it and they kicked him up and the mom started recording it, I think. And, certain people were, it would be a shame if the empty planes here, were set on fire. Stuff like that, and wink, wink, and it. I mean, I think things are going in a trajectory where it's not going to be jokes online, but people are going to start doing that stuff. And so then, not only do I think that that's not moral, but also that's going to be what the officials are going to use to then impose martial law.
Like Scott always says, Scott Horton, the action is in the reaction. There's nothing the state would love more than for us to be violent, so they have an excuse to crack down. And so don't do that, people.
Well, yeah, and what's ironic with that, too, if you bring like some of the, and I'm not saying this is a pejorative term, like conspiracy theorists or whatever, will say like, oh, no, Timothy McVeigh was set up. He didn't do that. It was, feds did that. It was a false flag. And it's like, okay, so if you're saying the feds, make it look like there was an attack on a federal building in order to gain more power, doesn't that mean then the worst thing for you to do is actually attack a federal building? If you admit that they would like it to look like that so that they can, that helps them. So for all these things that, people speculate may have been false flags, it's like, okay, so don't do a thing that if it were a false flag, you would agree helps the government. Like then, you're doing their job for them.
Yeah, tactically unsound for sure.
So thank you. We're coming up on time, Adam. I think we're over an hour here. I'd love to keep talking to you, but I wanted to respect your time, Bob. Did you have one last question, Adam?
No, I was just about to thank Bob for being so generous with his time, and you're our biggest get to date, and we are not worthy. So thank you so much for coming.
Oh, well, thanks for having me on. And again, just by pointing to texascommonsense.com, they'll read more on this stuff. And glad you guys are doing what you're doing.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for coming on. This has been the Battleborn Podcast. Until next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.